Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the ones joining us right on time, joining us live, and those that are going to be watching this on demand. Welcome to our next Success Series. It's actually a part two of this formatting visualization series. Last one we had was on pivot charts, pivot tables. They're all available on demand now. Today, we're going to be talking all about bar, column, line charts, you name it. We have Jeremy on the line with us. Before I pass the mic over to him, though, I have a couple of housekeeping items that I just want to make sure we go over. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So the chat is turned off, but we do have a Q&A portion of this webinar. We want to make sure that you have your chance to ask questions. So at the bottom of your screen, at any point of the webinar, please feel free to type in any questions you have. If it's something simple that little old Preston can handle, I'll try to my best to type that answer live. But if not, Jeremy is on the call with us, obviously, and he will save that to questions to the very end. There is a post webinar email that is going to include this recording. So again, feel free to take notes, but you will be given the recording and any links that Jeremy references on during the presentation. I'll include that in the post webinar post webinar email as well. There will be a survey in there also. Lastly, for those that have been paying attention, we also recently migrated our community experience to a new platform. The one awesome part about this migration is that there is now a dedicated space for customers like yourself, and I'm the one running it. So obviously, I'm trying to do a sneaky plug here to get more folks to participate, to join in there. There's a discussion post I have open just for you to give me feedback on things like the Success Series, topics that you'd like to hear. So when you get a chance, again, that link, if you haven't if you don't have it already, I'll include that in the post webinar email. And yeah, check out the community. Great. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our host, our speaker for today, Jeremy Freidel. He is our team lead in our software engineering and also our field engineering team. So Jeremy, thanks so much for again creating this series, taking the time to hop on and present. I will pass the mic over to you. I'll turn off my camera and hop back on during the Q&A session. For folks that are just joining now, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, drop them in the Q&A section. I'll be there moderating, and we'll come back at the very end to answer any questions that you didn't get answered. So, thanks, Jeremy.
No problem. Hi, everyone. So here, we'll get right into it. So we'll start with the table of contents. So we'll just go over some overview and objectives. We'll introduce high chart customizations in Sisense, and I'll explain what high charts is and how it connects to these types of charts. There's a standard event scripting overview. There's the widget lifecycle events. So there's an event specific to high charts before reloaded that I will go over. There's the ready event and the initialized and other events. There's best practices and common pitfalls, and so some key takeaways and Q&A, and just general points along the way. So I'll get right into it. So basically, the three chart types that we're discussing today, bar, column, and line, they all use as their visualization engine the JavaScript library high charts. So you might have seen high charts be used in contexts outside of Sisense. It's not specific to Sisense alone, but basically it's a visualization library that has quite a few customization options. And as a result, you can use it to set options and have it affect the visualizations of your charts. So basically, in terms of, so you can, of course, use the standard Sisense events that you're all familiar with, process results, ready, and similar, but you can also use custom events that are specific to high charts, mainly before reloaded. So why it matters that these three chart types use high charts and they might be useful for your scripting and customization and formatting is they enable chart formatting beyond the native widget design panel. So in Sisense, there's on the right-hand side, the native widget design panel that has things like axes, labels, series, options related to them. You can, of course, use them, but basically if there's some particular setting beyond them, high charts likely has an option related to that, and basically the script, the widget script can modify that option, and that will affect in the visualization. So you have access to the full high chart option object, so there's nothing sort of secret about what options high charts is using to render on the page. So you can basically, as you see here on the right, you can just console log with the script, basically the default high chart options that basically Sisense is passing in to render a given chart. Basically, that takes into account things like the design options that are already set using the Sisense UI, and also just based on the panels present and color options, theming, and so on. So that Sisense generates that on its own, basically to render the chart. And basically, you can take a look at that and then see basically if there's some of those options beyond the Sisense default and beyond the Sisense default design options that you want to edit. You can do that with scripting. So these changes apply to the high chart setting object before rendering, the before view loaded event, which is what we're going to use, and the following slide will describe. That happens before render. Yeah, so you can change the settings object, and that basically fully controls everything about the high charts end result. You access it by the before view loaded event. Basically, that's the event that fires just before high charts begins to render the chart. It does allow conditional styling. So basically, high charts itself has some programmatic options. Basically, you can pass in a function to high charts itself to do things like, for example, labels. You could have a function that high charts itself calls for every label and defines the labels. Yeah. So later on, I will share that I'll show some what the documentation page and the API reference looks like for that. But I'll just go into the next slide for now. So yeah, let's just go over the widget lifecycle. So if any of you were in the previous call or saw the recording or are just generally familiar with the widget lifecycle, this is going to look very familiar with you. Basically, all these standard Sisense events can be used with the three types of charts that we're describing today. So, initialized, for query, query end, process result, rendered. But sort of the unique one is the before view loaded. That's unique to the high charts used widgets. The big three are basically the three we're describing in this this presentation, and also high charts. They also use the high charts and can use the before view loaded session, and we still have the ready option. So basically, if you're at all familiar with scripting with other types of Sisense widgets, the vast majority of events are going to be similar. Sort of the one unique one is the before view loaded event, which modifies high chart options. So let's just, this slide describes what the before view loaded is. So you see here on the right, you see basically a very simple, I showed earlier what that looked like. Basically, with this event, basically you have on the second parameter that we call env here, we have that env.options, and it gives the full high charts options. Also on the right-hand slide, just to give context, because that was what I'm going to share what the high charts documentation looks like. Sisense does use a slightly custom version of high charts, but ultimately it tracks sort of the mainline high charts development and just add some custom stuff to it. So you can basically in the console of any Sisense page, just go ahead and do high charts.version. That'll change slightly based on the Sisense version. Yeah, but basically if you're looking at high charts documentation and you want to make sure that basically you're matching that English scripting, you can see. High charts usually doesn't change a whole lot version to version, but basically there's a specific option that exists in the specific version. You can use that. So yeah, the before view loaded event is basically where you can both console log and edit the high charts options. So you can view basically the default high chart options that Sisense generates for a bar, column, or line chart. And then if you basically see an option that you want to change, or you know an option that you want to change, you can then apply that. It's not like a total rewrite situation. It's not like if you change one setting, you have to redefine every setting that Sisense gives. Basically, you can use all the Sisense defaults that Sisense has already generated based on the chart and just change one parameter. It's not like once you start defining high chart options, you lose what Sisense has already predefined. Basically, just additive. It's not a replace. So you can alter these properties individually. So you can change only the parameters that you need. Basically, most scripts that involve high chart settings, you're realistically probably only going to change one setting. I mean, that's basically the typical, but you can of course change as many as you needed. And you can, like we just showed here, you can console log the default settings that Sisense generates based on your existing widget and the style options you have. And then basically you can get a sense of basically you want to modify that if needed. So let's go in and start looking at some links here. So basically I'll go over the best practices and then I'll start sharing some links. So if you're going to be using high charts options configurations, basically you're going to be modifying them, or you even want to have access to them. Before view loaded is the event. It works the same as any other Sisense event. It's not a special in terms of like how you use it. You use the standard widget add-on format, and you just call it the same way you would do like widget add-on initialize. You can use all the standard events. So for example, if you wanted to just modify the data itself, that would still make sense using the data events, not before view loaded in most cases. So, you could go in the process results and modify things about the series data, things about the access object or similar. You can, just like any other object, any other widget type in Sisense, if you basically have some customization that just needs to run after Sisense and HighCharts has finished rendered everything, you can just use the ready event to do post-render adjustments. That's always an option. You'll see, in especially some of the examples I'm going to show, that there often are multiple ways to do things. Basically, in terms of events, like there are things you can do with before reloaded that also, because basically Sisense sets the HighCharts options based on the widget context. Basically, things like style options, how the metadata is, and similar. If you modify something in process result, basically which happens before view loaded, and you modify something about the widget, that's going to be reflected in the HighCharts object that Sisense is going to generate. So you may not necessarily need to use before reloaded in that case. You can you often see basically, and you'll see that in some examples, that basically you can use process results to de facto set HighChart options. And if you want to check the HighChart version that you're working with in Sisense to match with the HighChart documentation, you can certainly do that on just putting a HighChart version in the console. So I'll go ahead now and start sharing some documentation links to just get some context here. Okay, so first I'll just go over, I think a lot of you are probably already familiar with this, especially if you've been in the last call. But basically, what in the context here where we're talking about scripting, we're talking about standard dashboard and widget scripting. You can, of course, use this in plugins as well. Basically, plugins use the same context, same events, but basically you can go ahead and use the standard widget menu to get to the edit script option in a widget or in a dashboard, and then apply the settings. And you can use the standard widget.on reference to use a specific event. So here is what the HighChart options look like. So basically, Preston will share the links here, but basically the standard URL is api.highcharts.com. And you have basically all these options here. So any of these options can basically be used and modified if needed on a Sisense widget. You can see this quite a bit here. I mean, some of these you wouldn't necessarily have to use, just basically the greater options you have, you only need to use the options that are actually relevant to your specific request. And like I said about the documentation, this is looking at the v12.6 version of HighCharts. HighCharts doesn't actually change all that much between version to version, but if you want, you can match up to the exact version of HighCharts Sisense is using. So here's like sort of a specific option. So here we're looking at, specifically plot options for the bar chart. So basically, you'll have this you'll see this object in the HighCharts options, and basically you can go in and then modify them as needed. So for example, here we have this color object action where you modify the color access, and you often see these often have examples basically that show how you use them. So I'll show how you use them and how they relate to Sisense. So you see here you have this specific color scheme where you have a bit of a gradient going on, and you see here basically that you have these options here. These are going to line in with what the options you see if you do that before reloaded and log the HighChart objects. Basically, you're going to be seeing these specific objects that are similar, or if they're not there already, you can create them and modify them as needed and add them to the object. And basically, so you see here, basically it showed you how you do it. If you wanted to, you could basically apply this exact settings that they have here and add them to the HighChart objects of a specific widget that you want to have this type of customization on, and it'll apply. So basically, the examples that you see in the HighCharts documentation are also with some modification applicable for Sisense widgets, dashboard scripts, and plugins. Okay, just so like we've discussed before, the standard widget event format works. Basically, the widget.on, name of event, you have a function, you can have usually 2 parameters here, and then basically you can do what you need to in the event here. So we sort of went over the standard flow. So we have initialize, fires when the widget first loads, DOM ready when the widget is rendered into the DOM, build query before query, query start. Most of these events, sort of the name matches what you expect, and also the description here is helpful to understand what they do. Preston will send a link to this as well. First result that executes after the widget's native results processing and allows customization to query results. Render happens when the widget is rendered. Ready happens when the widget is done rendering and the widget is ready. And just sort of go here. So before reloaded, so this is only relevant to the types of widgets that use HighCharts. So those bar, column, line, and pie are the main ones. And basically, like we've been discussing, basically you can use them to view the high chart objects and also modify them, and that'll be reflected in terms of how high charts renders. So let's get into some community examples. So here, basically, we have this how to customize the data labels. So we have some screenshots here. See the data labels here. And we see here before view loaded. And we just went into the high chart objects here, and we just changed these parameters. So we're changing the data labels.style. That is basically like a object of CSS parameters. So we just changed basically the CSS parameters like font size and color. These match exactly sort of the CSS parameter names. Basically, just we use this camel case. HighCharts does in terms of parameters, but basically it's the style objects in HighCharts follow the CSS as you would expect. So you see here, we're just making the font size bigger and changing the font color or any other. You can also do the font itself or similar. So basically, that's just the basic HighCharts example there. And Preston will share all these links. So here's a plugin. So as I've been saying, basically the same events that are used in widget events and dashboard events can also plugins. Basically, you can use this. They use the same events. And so basically, this particular one changes the color scheme. But basically, even though this is a single category, if you wanted basically each bar to have its own color scheme or similar, basically, and it also can work with the palette, which is basically the themed parameter inside Sisense. So just to show, so basically, so here we use Prism, which is an object that you often use in plugin, but basically the actual events are sort of standard dashboard events. So we use the dashboard widget process result event, and basically we set the color scheme. So here you can see you can do styling basically entirely with process results. Basically, we modify the color that's each category has in the process result object. And basically that's passed into at the end result before view loaded object. So basically high charts, yes, the color is in the high charts object, but basically if it's easier in this example, for example, to set the colors before view load event, just have the colors in the results object. That is ultimately going to be reflected in the high charts objects, but basically we can modify the high charts and results setting objects without actually ever using the before reloaded event, because basically it takes into account things we do before that, like at the process result stage. Here, so we're centering bar and columns. So here, basically, we have this sort of look here, and we want basically it to be more centered, more like this. So basically, we use a widget script like this. So we use the before reloaded event. So basically, this is an example where basically maybe the high charts default the Sisense set in this particular example is just not the most visually appealing, at least for a certain customer's taste. So basically, we can go in and basically I mean, this is again where I was saying you can use logic. So basically here we're using some logic to find the right panels. Basically, this is a conditional. Basically, we only want to apply this if there's no break by panel. So we can have some logic basically to check that there's no break by panels and then use that. And then basically we just go in and just change the high chart objects setting. So basically we're just setting the grouping to be false. Often the actual like setting that's being changed in high charts is relatively simple. Here we're ultimately setting a single setting. The reason why the script's a bit longer is basically we want it to be specific. We want it to only apply for when there's no break by. So that's where most of this code is. The actual core like logic style change is basically only this. We were just changing the grouping to be false parameter. So basically a lot of times in scripting like this, the hard part, so to speak, is to find the right setting. Once you find the right setting, the actual script can be very small. It can often be 3 or 4 lines. Just basically, it just sometimes a matter of just finding the right high chart setting for a given style that we want. Again, we can take this dashboard script or widget script and make it a plugin. So basically, this is the exact same code, but we just make it a plugin. So we use the Prism object to hook into the dashboard object, and then we hook into the widget object, and then we have the same basic code, which shows that basically things you do in widget and dashboard scripting, you can also do in plugins. Here, so basically we're modifying the upper labels here that are called plot plans. So basically we default styling customer wanted to change. So basically we use the before reloaded. We set some parameters and basically so there's x-axis. Basically we go into the x-axis option here and basically we set basically repeatedly these things like font size and maximum number of lines and similar. Just examples of things you can do with high charts. Here, basically here's an example of a render script. So basically, even though it's modifying ultimately high charts related objects, like plot options. You can do things basically often, basically settings that you change in other areas ultimately are affecting the high chart object. So there's multiple events that can do the same thing. Basically here is similar. Here is an example of, using a DOM ready. This is basically just purely CSS. So as opposed to using high charts or similar, we just go in and modify the element that high charts creates and set with CSS. That's always an option. Basically standard CSS always works. This is sort of an example of how you can use just about any event to do very similar things. Here, basically, we're using plus result, basically to just set parameters like the spaces for the labels. I mean, ultimately, the things we add to the plus result objects are going to be past high charts, and basically, it's going to be reflected there. So that's sort of an example of how that works. Yeah, so that's great. I'll share some additional examples later, but I'll also just go back to the slideshow now. Okay, so we saw all those community examples and a few more. I'll go into the live demos now. So let me just share my screen.
Hey, Jeremy, and as you're just pulling that up, I'm gonna just give a extra nudge that if there is any questions or things for clarification, again, at the bottom of your screen, viewers, there is a Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom window. So again, any point you have any questions that need more clarification, feel free to drop a question there. All right, sorry to be the ghost hopping in here, Jeremy. Back to you.
No, happy to take questions. Yeah, no, that sounds great. So we'll see some live demos here. So basically here, we changed the line width. We gave each band a different color. Basically, we just use that with see the exact same script here. So basically, we use widget.on before we loaded, and we just see exactly what we do here. So basically, we set the high chart options here, and basically, we modify ultimately the line width option within the series. So that makes it bigger. We can modify the marker also, and we can also, we're just sort of giving each plot band basically to the color. I mean, this can of course be programmatic. I mean, here it's all coded, but you can have a function that just loop through and set the color programmatically based on some parameter. And like I've been saying, basically, it's basically any widget. You can go in here and go to edit script, and that's what we've been talking about. These are standard Sisense scripts. Okay. Here, again, we have a line chart with different styles. So basically, we go from this solid color to this dotted line. Here, we can see basically all the, actually, I think there are more, but the many of the different types of line chart styles that are options. And so I'll show you what that script looks. So this is a bit clever. And also, again, this is an example of how you can use plus result to only set the high chart objects, because basically the high chart objects looks at what the results parameter is. So basically, this is ultimately going to be reflected in the high chart objects without actually if you manually use the before preloaded event. So basically, we have this array of line styles, and we just went one at a time and basically just set each of them. So we could see basically all the different line styles that are set here and what those look like. In an actual chart, you probably would want to use some of them, but just to show all of them off. So that's an example of high charts, line chart customization, without actually having to use the before reloaded event directly. Here we just do something like, round the corners. Here's what I'm saying, like this is ultimately set in high chart options, but we can just do it in plus result as well. You can do it in before reloaded as well. It's sort of just a matter of personal taste for the most part. Basically, they're identical in actual end result. But we just set the border radius to an integer. Basically, the larger the integer, the more rounded the corners are. Like I said, these scripts, even if they're pretty dramatic in terms of how they customize the look, can be very short. I mean, this is a 3-line script that changes the look and feel. So here's a sort of you can do some interesting stuff with the, because ultimately it's the high chart library that's being used. So basically, it can do a lot of interesting things that basically Sisense necessarily use, because often they're pretty niche. But basically here, we just take this chart and make it look 3D by giving it look at it slightly off angle. And we don't even actually have to even use the before reloaded event for that. I mean, ultimately, this is going to be reflected in the high charts event that's being generated, but basically we're not manually modifying it. We're just going basically setting these options, 3D options, that's ultimately going to be represented exactly as is on high chart objects. So we just basically set these parameters and give it a depth, and it'll look 3D. I'm not sure how often that would actually be used, but it shows you can do some interesting stuff with high charts. Basically, if high charts has an option and a feature, you can sort of use it, even if Sisense itself doesn't use it by default. Here, we're sorting chart categories based on their total value. So we're just basically changing so it does in this order as opposed to the alphabetical order. So that's an example. So basically, here's an example of, again, we're modifying the data. So basically, it makes much more sense as a process result after the data has been changed to raw values to the sort of the values that Sisense ultimately passed HighCharts to be rendered. And basically, we just modify the data, and this is the best event for it. Basically, we just use a standard sorting parameter. And here, I mean, ultimately, this formatting function is going to be exactly past HighCharts. So this is an example where I said how HighCharts can take in a function and use it to generate things like labels. So basically, the HighCharts itself is going to run this function to generate each specific label. And this is an example of how you can pass in specific HighCharts settings, basically, without ever using before reloaded. You're using process result. But basically, this data is going to be passed into the HighCharts option, including things like setting functions that are run by HighCharts that have logic. Okay, just going to go on. Okay, here we're just basically example of some dramatic styling. We set the background to be black, set the charts to be bright green. We added some black and white numbering, similar. So basically, show you what that looks like. Basically, we changed things on render. So basically, we changed some labels and similar. These basically is a HighChart setting objects, but again, we don't necessarily need to use before reloaded to set them. And we just set these styles. And we also, at the process result stage, also set some styling. Basically, everything we did here is basically just changing style options. If you are familiar with basically CSS, you sort of should recognize what's being done here. Basically, these are matching exactly with CSS options, basically. But instead of manually using CSS, basically HighCharts itself takes CSS type options. Okay, so here we have an example of changing how the data is shown. Basically, we take this data and make it look like a waterfall. So here, before reloaded. So basically, this is an example of basically everything about the HighCharts chart is defined by HighCharts. So basically, we actually just go in and change the chart type to waterfall. And basically, this changes it from like the default, which is a bar column chart here. And basically, we also change things about the styling. So you can make some really dramatic changes. Here we actually change the chart type that HighCharts is using to waterfall, which has a little bit different look and has some different ways it shows logic and data. So this is the last sort of live demo here. Dynamically changing the shape and size based on the values. So basically, here you can see basically the triangle is customized based on whether it's going up or down or similar results. And basically, we have that here. So you can definitely have logic based. Basically, here we just have a series of cutoffs. Basically, if it's greater than a certain value, make the data marker look like a certain value. If it's less than, we can also have a default. And this can be as customized as possible. So here we just have a series of cutoffs, but basically any JavaScript function can be used here. It doesn't have to be as simple as a numeric series of if statements. Basically, HighCharts can take basically, or Sisense in general can basically take any logic-based thing. So basically, there's basically some more advanced logic that we want to use to set how the markers are shown in this example. That certainly is possible. So that is the end of live demos. I have a few more points I'd like to make. So some key takeaways. So HighCharts expands visual customization. HighCharts is the visual library that Sisense uses to render the bar, column, and line charts. It also does pie charts. So this provides programmatic access to formatting, access configuration, label styling, series appearances, and other things. The HighCharts documentation also is a relevant resource. Other events ultimately affect HighChart options. So basically, just because you're using, ultimately at the end of the day, HighChart options doesn't necessarily mean that every script needs to use the before reload event. It just sort of where the HighChart object is most visible. It is the primary HighChart options modification event. So basically, if you have a script that the only thing it does, it just changed one HighChart option, that probably makes sense to use the before reloaded event. And other types of scripts, they're sort of a matter of taste on which event makes the most sense. So this event exposed the HighChart options directly as opposed to indirectly, where basically the logic that you have indirectly affects HighChart events at the end. With this, you just modify the finished HighChart object. Basically, the Sisense has finished generating sort of the best representation of all the style changes that you've made in the UI and so on, and create a high chart object. And then you can go ahead in your script and basically modify it further if needed. Match the event to a script. So process result handles data and access bounds. Before view loaded handles high charts configuration. Ready handles post render scripting. As we saw, you can often use different events to basically have the same end result. But basically, for certain types of scripts, basically, the event makes most sense. For example, anything that related to data or modifying data, usually process result is the correct event. The full high chart options are available. So basically, Sisense, when it creates the high chart objects, it's not going to use every single parameter that high charts has. But if you see basically an event or a parameter that exists in high charts documentation, you can just basically add it to the object. Basically, Sisense only sets the objects that are basically different from the high charts default. But if you wanted to set the high charts default for a given parameter and you see it in the documentation, you can certainly add it basically to the event as a new parameter. And basically, it just needs to match the version. So you can check what the high charts version Sisense uses, and then basically check the documentation. And if you see basically a parameter that you think would be helpful, you can just add it to the object if it's not already in the default high chart objects. And so you should maintain clean structure. Basically, so we talked a lot about styling change and similar. Basically, if you have some logic-based code, modifying data or similar, that should probably be, if possible, separated, in a separate function or similar. Basically, just in general, you probably heard this before, just separating out form and function. Basically, keep your formatting and styling related code on its own, and keep any code that basically is related to logic, like changing data, on its own. Avoid using hard-coded values. So basically, it's often tempting to just basically, you have a given widget, you just, the index for everything. You can hard code the index, you can hard code the titles. But often you can make it a bit more open-ended. Basically, if it's always going to be changing, for example, the x-axis, you can just basically have it point to the x-axis as opposed to hard coding like the name of the particular column that you're using or something similar. Often, basically, you can make the scripts more open-ended, that basically you can modify the script without breaking your script, modify the widget without breaking the script by basically making things more logic-based as opposed to hard-coded strings or integers. Yeah, so I'm ready for the Q&A. Thanks for your time, everyone. It's been great speaking. Hopefully we have some questions.
Thanks, Jeremy. Hey, no questions yet, but I think it's probably due to the presentation. What I will share is Francois mentioned that this was a very insightful session, so he thanked you for taking your time to do this. So
No
I know we're
problem.
a bit over on time. Jeremy, that was awesome. Obviously, great examples, great, very thorough content. I'll keep this open for another minute while folks consider hopping in, and any final questions for Jeremy here. I'm going to go ahead and steal screen share here, Jeremy, and I'm going to do it again. My second sneaky plug on our new community platform. The next success series is actually going to be a walkthrough, so not always technical, but the next one we're planning is to give you guys a rundown of how our new community is looking like. Very, very similar, and a lot of what you'd expect to see in terms of our previous community platform. However, just a bit of a facelift here. The big point that I want to point you guys to, if you haven't been in the community yet, is to please hop to this chapter section. This is where you'll find specific segmented groups based on kind of what makes sense for you. I am specifically running this one for Sisense customers. I want this to almost feel like an always on newsletter here, where you will see upcoming events. Obviously, the past events are here with the previous success series, one about our AI ready analytics, and then obviously have some more people hop in and comment on the discussion here. So I'm sad to see that I haven't been able to coerce any of you to comment on success series topics that you'd be interested in, but this will be the spot to do it. So there's my sneaky plug, the last one for today, I promise. We have a couple Q&A question here. Again, Jeremy, all just positive feedback for you. Great stuff. Great feedback for you. So if that's the case, folks, I will cut it off here. Something new is you'll also see this in the post-webinar email, but we recently uploaded all our success series into a YouTube playlist. So very easy, hopefully, for you to share with your team. If you want to revisit, you'll know where to find it. I'll also put that recording in the community, that link to the success series playlist in the community as well. So when you hop in there, you'll know that's where you'll go in and find it. So Awesome. Appreciate you all for joining, sticking with us, staying the whole time. I'm glad some of you are at least finding these helpful, and we will continue doing them. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot, Jeremy. Thanks, everyone.
No problem.